All right. Welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I'm here with Brendan Graham Dempsey. I am super excited. Brendan is back. He was on episode 50, where we did a TED toward a metamodern spirituality. And I got to say, folks, I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since we scheduled it. I was looking forward to it before then, because we're going to talk about Brendan's book, Metamodern, The Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics. And Brendan sent me this book. And I was like, I know a fair amount about metamodernism. And, I have a sense, Brendan and I have talked a hell of a lot. I have a sense about where he's coming from. So I'll skim it, okay? And be like, hey, yeah, cool. That's not what happened, okay? I opened this book. I saw the table of contents. I read the preface. And I read every goddamn sentence that followed. Okay. And that is not common for me these days. You usually especially you get halfway in, then run to the back. This is a great book from my vantage point. And so I just want everybody to know that. It moved me. I love the gestalt of it. I love the parts of it. I love the way it was woven together. And I think it is the best damn statement on metamodernism that I've come across. So, Brendan, welcome.
Thank you very much. And thanks for that awesome review. And yeah, I'm excited to dive in and appreciate. I'm glad you like the book, and yeah, let's get into the meat of it. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, tell me, you've been writing a lot. My understanding was that you were working on something like the meaning of meaning. I think we talked about that with John, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I also did this book. You had done emergentism. Of course, you are an author, an accomplished one at that. But tell us about kind of where this book came from.
Yeah, I was writing this long book. I'm calling it the tome at the moment, just because it's this sprawling thing. And I'd gotten about 500 pages into that, and then I was just realizing more and more with a lot of the conversations I was seeing about metamodernism online and other places that just there was just this gap. There wasn't anything that could allow people to kind of a broad overview of this topic, and it seemed like there was a lot of confusion. That, it's just sort of basic stuff. Made sense that like people might be associating this term with certain things, but then missing out on all this other stuff that it related to. I also, a while ago, did a poll on the Metamodern Spirituality group, just saying, like, what do you think would be like the most valuable, helpful book at the moment? And listed some options. And by far, the winner of that was a book on metamodernism that kind of synthesized the different strands of the conversation and provided sort of some introduction to it. So I was like, okay. So at a certain point, I'm just like, someone's got to write this book, so I'll do it. So I kind of put that other book on hold, and just spent about 4 weeks writing this thing. I've been sort of immersed in this discourse for a while, so it was just a matter mostly of kind of getting it all out on the page. And it was also helpful for me to kind of, clarify my own ideas around some of what, kind of bridges everything together. But so I kind of just put that out there and felt good about it. And I thought, hopefully this will be, helpful for people. And it certainly, caused a bit of a stir already, and people are kind of digesting it a bit. And so we can talk about some of that. But that was sort of the genesis for it. And it's largely to kind of fill a gap in the literature that this discourse has been around for about 10 years now in some form or another. And there's still no kind of intro to metamodernism book. There's also kind of a way in which some of the ideas, some people just will be talking past each other because they'll be using different conceptions and just not be familiar with the whole breadth of the conversation. So I thought this would be a service to the community and to the whole kind of discourse in general to have something like this out there.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, I mean, we'll get into this, but this thing, you delineate core themes. We'll go by chapter. And I love this because, I got pulled into this thing. In 2011, I called my Unified Theory book a postmodern grand metanarrative. That's what I called it. And the other thing that happened to me in relationship to the sensibility is I was one day, I developed the garden in 2016, and then I'm in this structure, and I have no idea that I'm like in a sensibility at all, really. And then I learn about the metamodern, and then I learn sincere irony as both as a genre, as a sensibility, as an artistic movement. And I was like, oh my God, that's what that thing is. So one of the things I'm going to be celebrating here as we go through this is my own reflection on my conceptual organization, Okay. My own experience of the different genres, the sense that that they're separate, but also can be woven together to see a whole. And damn if this book doesn't do that. Okay. So that's the thing. And I also want to start, the other thing I found to be brilliant is the subtitle. Okay. And you probably know why I have a deep appreciation for the subtitle. But, my first question to you is, can you say a bit about the subtitle and where that came from?
Yeah, so there's a book called Postmodernism, or The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. And this is a book that it's a pretty kind of classic, talking about postmodernism. It's by Frederick Jameson. And it's a lengthy book that kind of just offers an interpretation of, what by then had already been sort of a discourse that was around for a bit. And so it's kind of a classic for talking about this whole thing as a cultural logic. He uses that phrase, and he's coming from his own tradition, more rooted in sort of like economic Marxian takes and interpretations and things. But just that idea of cultural logic gets picked up by the metamodern early theorists, and get a lot of mileage for trying to frame metamodernism as a cultural logic. And so it seemed that in trying to articulate something of this sort of meta move, that it had a nice sort of a kind of sincerely ironic nod to both that old classic work, but also kind of captures something of this recursive element of a cultural logic of cultural logics. And I play with a little bit of some of that in the book and just in the writing style of it. And it's not just all play either. It is trying to capture something important about what I think this is all about, which is this sort of meta awareness and a recursive awareness of cultural logics, and that metamodernism seems to be a cultural logic that is explicitly dealing with these different, whatever you want to call them, modes of being, sensibilities, structures of feeling, etc., and orients them in some way. So I don't know. It seemed like a nice way to kind of wrap all that up into kind of a pithy little subtitle.
Well, okay, so this is where the resonance starts for me. Okay, and then we can go into the opening and preface and what the essence of sort of what you define the essence of metamodernism is, and I certainly feel this, in just experientially. So here's my connection to it, which I know you'll have a sense of, but I'll just say it. So as people know, the real root of the Unified theory in 1996 is this idea of justification. And then this idea that, oh my God, from an evolutionary perspective, propositional language and question answer dynamics actually give rise to the problem of justification, and a lot of what gets built at the level of human into personhood consciousness is a function of this justification dynamic. And really what the experience is, and this is why I love your subtitle so much, the experience of me was I was inside this epistemological, socially constructed narrative, and I was an appreciative of both philosophy and the postmodern critique of all of this. But the justification at that time, theory, hypothesis, then systems theory, shifts the angle and turns the embeddedness of our epistemological conundrums and what we do, and then the relativism, into, oh, that's the ontology of what it is that we're doing. That's the logic of our epistemology, right? And now, oh my God, I now know that I'm doing this. And indeed, of course, UTOK itself will be very much framed as a branch of justification and a flower in systems of justification. So I found that to be enormously similar to some of the stuff that I was doing. And then I also found the sentiment right on target. And I just think it's a beautifully recursive capture, right? And I just really I would encourage all of us, those of us that are celebrating this book, and maybe we'll get into some people that are critiquing, right? The cultural logic of our, and UTOK will give us our word of justification. You can find other words, but whatever. Here we are doing that thing. And I love the way you captured it in the subtitle. So
yeah, and I mean, I'm sure we'll get into this as we go through the chapters and talk about the meta-narrative chapter, which largely focuses on your work and justification systems, and so folds that in. But that is it. It's sort of like there's this move that happens when you're sort of like in your case, you start theorizing about justification systems, and then you realize that itself is an instantiation of a justification system. So you get this kind of recursive loop. And similarly, I see this kind of being a dynamic you can be aware of in culture more broadly at the moment, of sort of like, as we reflect on a thing, we have to kind of wind up situating ourselves in that thing that we're reflecting on, and then this sort of kind of forces this kind of broader meta move on the whole thing. And so that plays kind of a key, that's sort of a leitmotif, I guess you could say, of what I see happening in all these different metamodernisms, yours, your contributions included. Yeah.
Totally. And in fact, that's where we start, right? The book basically, after the preface, opens up on what you would say, or at least that's what at least the opening frame and salvo and orienting is this sort of self-recursive positioning of our knowledge in relation.
Yeah. So in structuring this, right, it was sort of like what are the through lines? What are the leitmotifs? And so the first chapter sort of just tries to set up a kind of template and a set of ideas that once you have them, you can kind of see them recur again and again in these different articulations of metamodernism. And so and there's a whole other level which would be too much to get into now, but there is a kind of meta level where it's like, I'm kind of aware of the fact that, like, how would I say, like, to do the kind of project that I have to do, I have to use these terms and set things up in a certain way. And so, but we don't have to get into that. But I'll just say that having a kind of template like this is helpful for then being able to track these different dynamics into, different versions of this metamodern conversation. And eternal recursion is one of the key kind of notions there. So I'm kind of in a little nod to Nietzsche of eternal recurrence, but in a different way, talking about this notion that there's this process at work in society where we reflect upon, we could just say reflect on our justification systems essentially, and then basically wind up creating justification systems that include our prior justification systems and create sort of second order justifications that are built on those. It would be a kind of UTOK framing of the idea. And then you can look at this and kind of see how over, the development of things like modernity and postmodernity and now metamodernity, how these things kind of keep folding themselves in. The whole first chapter kind of sets out some basic ideas and that are largely based on that. What I was going to say was that on this whole like kind of meta awareness aspect is that all these kind of metamodern interventions or people putting out their ideas about what metamodernism is, almost everyone begins by saying, all right, well, why is it called metamodernism? And then they've got to justify using meta as a prefix. And so a lot of kind of the literature does some version of that. So I was doing a version of that. I'm just going to be like, I'll just come out and call it the meta abstract, reflection, basically of reflexive abstraction, which when you think about someone talking about, oh, that show is really meta, or, that's so meta, whatever, that's a move that's become very familiar to folks. But it was kind of interesting because no one necessarily picked up on that aspect in any of the existing metamodern frameworks and just kind of explicitly said it. Jason Storm to some degree does talk about kind of a second order thing, and we can talk about that. But just, framing it that way, I think just kind of helps people get their bearings a bit of like when we're talking about this then using that as sort of a touchstone. I think it helps people get a sense of, oh, okay, there's this kind of recursive, remove going on and then reflecting on things. So anyway, the whole first chapter is just trying to lay that idea out and get people kind of an intuitive sense of that, and then track that through these different
So and that, to me, this is a great way to sort of start. So we're going to basically be recursively self-aware. All right. So, and then that plays a very nice role in the evolution of sort of traditional thinking to scientific thinking, trying to get aware in a particular sort of way, and then aware of that critique, and then aware of us as justifying in a particular way. And then, to me, what you're doing is you're explicitly now labeling this dimension. And a couple of days ago, I was developing a blog, getting into some of the iQuad shit, and I watched 3 hours on the evolution of I, the imaginary number.
Cool.
and what it is and why Gauss and other people thought that was a horrible name. It's actually a lateral concept that twirls around the concepts in a particular kind of way. And actually, I thought of your concept of basically seeing and labeling this dimension in relations. Like and that's not gonna cause it to then actually, it's like, no, they're not going to meta. But it's like, okay, no, here, and in fact, you can't do imaginary on imaginary. The nature of the relation is like, we're not going to find a whole nother imaginary thing. It loops back around itself when you capture this thing. And so anyway, that was, I had that association of you delineate, we're coming aware of this sort of like imaginary dimension. We're going to place ourselves in it. We'll see this all the way to its, but actually it's going to loop back around and not cause us to go insane, but it's going to be contained and it's going to be a crucial part of the equation. And I do think the sensibility of what modern is relative to postmodern is very much along those lines. And I think you set that up with a very, very, I think you nailed the nexus of it in the opening chapter.
Thanks. That's a really cool connection. Actually, I hadn't made that myself, but yes, the way that for me, it's kind of like a positive, negative number sort of a thing, right? Where you multiply them by themselves and then you kind of negate what they were. So if you multiply a negative by a negative, you get a positive, right? It's not you just get all these infinite dimensions of negativity or something. So there is kind of a circularity and a kind of closed loopness to it that that also pertains to I. And I think that is important because like one of the arguments that I try to make, right, is that like carrying reflection further doesn't necessarily just lead to infinite reflection. It leads to the ability to reflect on maybe there's not a need for reflecting at so many levels at the moment, right? And being able to sort of toggle it appropriately through the different levels of reflection. So it's an interesting kind of theoretical question of like, well, won't this just go on infinitely or what have you? And culture to some degree, I think it's an interesting idea. Like as culture continues to unfold, yes, of course, we are going to get a reflection on metamodernism, et cetera, and then kind of keep going in that sense. But I think you're capturing something important, which is that once you name this dynamic, it doesn't lead you into this infinite hall of mirrors. It can actually then begin to explain some of the kind of simplicity and the kind of non-reflective stances that we see intentionally, enacted in metamodern art, for example, and stuff. So I think that's a cool connection.
Yeah. So anyway, the point is that this captures and sort of caps off a particular angle. And of course, culture is an infinite game, to use Karst's term. We're going to be, this is not the end. I don't think any of us are like, oh, this is the end of cultural consciousness or justification or anything along these lines. That would be absurd. But it filled a particular gap and it framed it in a particular way that I thought, and yes, I would, that's why I'm trying to say, hey, actually, I think it's kind of like imaginary numbers and they loop, just to make it simple, and I'm not a mathematician, but they loop essentially back around and there's not going to be an infinite regressive, a whole bunch of different infinite dimensions of imaginary like numbers. This is not an infinite dimensions of meta, but this is creating a particular frame on the dimension of self-recursive awareness. The other thing I want to say about it is that it angles us on the nature of the evolution of meaning, and we'll come back to that, and development, so that as you basically are like, okay, to advance to the next stage, you need to include the stage before, and it doesn't necessarily need us to get into, a belief of spiral dynamics, but I think it affords us a clarity about evolution and learning and development and what has to come before to what then sets the stage for what comes after.
Yeah, exactly. And that's well said. And I've been struggling in some of these conversations around metamodernism because, again, some people will tend to elide or conflate it with certain other models, integral theory, spiral dynamics, whatever. They'll just say, oh, that's what this is. And it's like, well, no. At the same time, then you'll get other people being like, no, metamodernism has absolutely nothing to do with any kind of progressive, or complexification or development or anything like that. And I say, well, no, that's not quite right either. If we understand, the kind of deeper structural currents under here. And so again, maybe naively, my attempt with this book is to try to bring some of these different ways of seeing this discourse together, and to be kind of showing them, it's not as simple as either of those sort of, reductionistic, either or situations. And so there is something, what word one wants to use is kind of will depend on the different kind of camps one comes from. But even in the kind of aesthetic framing of metamodernism, there's this notion that there's some kind of idea of progress and history that returns, but it's not this sort of absolutistic Hegelian, absolute kind of culmination of things or what have you. And I think that there's just a lot of way of bringing together these different ideas in a manner that, it doesn't have to be antagonistic or particularly kind of, use language that has a lot of baggage to it. Because some people lean very heavily into like psychological framings of development. And I personally find a lot of that to be really interesting. And there's a lot of kind of room for academic and intellectual exploration there that I think has yet to be done. So I'm excited about that. But I can also see why like people looking mainly at art and stuff are sort of like, I don't know what stage or level of complexity or whatever. I'm just seeing these patterns here. And yet at the same time, right, there is something deeply kind of advancing and sort of sequential about cultural changes and developments. And to presume that, that metamodernism is somehow moving beyond postmodernism, but in a way that is just like a total lateral move doesn't really make sense either, because it has to somehow incorporate the insights of postmodernism for it to be postmodern. So all these things are implicit in a, kind of there, in the discourse. And I just wanted to find some language that I felt like could be common language for these different discourses, different strands to come together and be able to speak about it, so that it didn't have to alienate, like some demographic or group, depending on what words we're using for this kind of thing.
Well, for me, that's so I knew that there were sort of this cluster, of different domains that sort of spoke overlapping, but also disparate languages, and it was confusing. And obviously I'm steeped in UTOK, and that's where my world is. And I then touch base with other worlds, but that's where my world is. So I'm like, okay, I'm not the most cultured fellow, and one meaning of the word. And then, but what this book does, and I like to think that it has some parallels with what I did in psychology. So what I'm doing in psychology, as I'm building, my more early focus on psychology, is like, there's all these different parts, in schools, and they talk at each other, and if you're inside of it, you don't really know, is there a perspective that you can get that sees both the uniqueness and the elements, but is there a gestalt that affords a weave? This is the elephant, or there are different mountains in a landscape. And here, what this book does, what I saw it does, it delineates, and let's get into aesthetics in a second, but I'll just list. After we frame this as the core element of a certain kind of recursivity, self-aware recursivity, we're going to look then at aesthetics and its development there. We're going to look at complexity science. We're going to look at philosophy and meta-narrative. And then we're going to land on this idea that as we zoom further back, we can frame how people see themselves in the world ultimately. And then what this is the different shades of these things zoom ultimately back. So that's where the book walks us through. I thought that it laid out both the territory and did justice to the territory, and then put the pieces of the territory in together that gave me at least a really clear and helpful gestalt.
Thanks. Yeah. And that was really the goal. And yeah, I mean, in some ways, your efforts to unify the field of psychology are, comparable to the sort of move I'm trying to do here by attempting to unify this field of metamodernism, which isn't to say these are all saying the same thing. It's to try to situate them as different meaningful parts of that gestalt, right? So like when you come out with UTOK, you're not saying, and so everything ultimately is just behavioralism or Freudianism or something. It's like, well, no, we can put these parts in a kind of a frame together and see how they relate to each other. We can also see how they meaningfully differ. And of course, there will also be things that any given perspective, if it is trying to sort of say it is the sum totality of everything, it might be very wrong in saying certain kinds of claims like that. So it's not to also say that everything that all of these things are saying is right either. It's just seeing that how they might fold together into kind of a unified theory of metamodernism or something. But that is still, again, one that tries to be sensitive to the fact that these are still different strands of a discourse. I don't know. For me, it's just kind of infuriating that we're all using this word. We're all talking about what to me seem like very overlapping sorts of phenomena. And yet it's sort of like, why then feel like, oh, this has nothing to do with what I'm doing? And, oh, we can't let this touch in any way my field. And I don't know, that sort of siloed tribalistic approach to this topic is like unnecessary and doesn't really do us any good. So if this is something that's kind of coming online and as an emerging cultural zeitgeist, as a kind of philosophical kind of next step, as a new way of even framing and thinking about cultural changes and developments, then let's see if we can kind of have this conversation be framed as one big conversation with maybe some different pockets rather than just people talking past each other, basically.
Right, and there's nothing there, continuity, similarity, part of a gestalt versus differentiation, clarity, identification of specifics. Those aren't contradictory. You can you're welcome to So if we go into the aesthetics chapter, if there's movements in aesthetics, that doesn't mean, and I'm in meta-narrative, and I'm UTOK's part of meta-narrative, and I don't like this move in aesthetics, that's okay. I don't need there's no threat here, right? At that level of differentiation, how it all fits together and whether I want to be a part of this group, ultimately is a potential question. But to me, at least the way I saw it, the capacity for a gestalt relative to differentiating parts was held very clearly in the way you laid it out. So there wouldn't be, I'd be surprised if there were a lot of like, oh gosh, I need more differentiation or I need more control or things like that.
Yeah. I mean, so it's always touchy because some of these things are fields where people are doing a particular project and they're interested in a particular thing, right? So if you're in academia and you want to talk about this new show that came out and you want to use a metamodern rubric to talk about that show and you can write a paper on it and that's a whole thing. That's great. That's good stuff. But then at the same time, if someone's talking about postmodern philosophy and they're trying to get into issues around semiotics and stuff, and they're also using a word like metamodernism, these two people might be like, well, wait a second, how are we having the same conversation here? And so like you do in a lot of your work, if you can get above that and see how these things relate, then a lot of that can be hopefully kind of resolved while being respectful of the fact that, yeah, these are different conversations within a broader one. And at the same time, I would just posit that it's up for the readers to determine whether or not this is a success, right? If these are radically different conversations and they have nothing to do with each other, then this book that I've written should just be an utter failure because it's so obvious that these things have nothing to do with each other. But at the same time, if you read the book and you're like, oh yeah, that actually does seem to all kind of cohere together in a meaningful way, then that's the case I'm just trying to make. So it's up for people to decide if they find it convincing or not. Yeah.
Lovely. Yeah, no, fair enough. Across all levels. Why don't we talk a little bit about aesthetics? So in that chapter, we're basically, is it fair to say that sort of at least some of the earliest terms and sensibilities of metamodern pops up in the context of aesthetics?
Yeah. So kind of the word really emerges in cultural studies, and there had been already this kind of ongoing conversation around the decline of postmodernism. Postmodernism itself is a very broad term, right? So you can talk about postmodern architecture, but you could also talk about postmodern theory and postmodern philosophy and all those sorts of things, right? So metamodernism is a similar category, but there's certainly a thing called postmodern art, and it has a kind of rubric and certain kind of characteristics that people have over the years identified: cynical, kind of self-referential, very ironic, et cetera, et cetera. And there had been a heyday of that stuff for a while, especially kind of peaking in the 90s, early 90s, and then we started seeing different things that didn't really match that anymore. And people were like, well, what do we call this? So one of the earliest ways that this shows up on the scene is, people just trying to give a name to the new characteristics of art that are showing up, and trying to make sense of it. And there are some kind of different attempts to formulate some ideas about what comes after postmodernism, at least as kind of an artistic period. Sure. And that's where metamodernism really shows up and gets going in earnest, is in 2010 with this paper by these two Dutch cultural theorists named Tim Vermeulen and Ruben van Danneker. Mm-hmm. And they do this thing called Notes on Metamodernism. And they seem to kind of hit on something that really worked in a way that some of the other formulations of postmodernism didn't. Mm-hmm. And so, they saw this dynamic of this new kind of art seemed to be moving back and forth between some of that postmodern cynicism and irony, and then into this other kind of more typically modern kind of sincerity and kind of enthusiasm and mm-hmm. utopianism. And so they kind of define, they recognize this characteristic, and they refer to this dynamic as an oscillation back and forth. And it really jump-started this whole new way of then being able to analyze art that before was sort of like, a Wes Anderson movie or a Ted Lasso or something comes out, and you're like, well, that's not postmodern. This doesn't ring to me like a Radiohead or some kind of South Park send up or something. So that's where metamodernism really gets going as a kind of paradigm to talk about culture. And to be fair, also, it's not purely limited to art either. I mean, the cultural studies folks, they would try to make the case that you see metamodern shifts happening all over the place in culture, including politics, including, various kinds of new economic and institutional things as well. So it is a cultural studies approach, though. And that's just kind of an initial framing that does a lot of work. And so for me, though,
now, did they coin the term sincere irony? Were those the folks?
They coined a couple of these characteristics: sincere irony, pragmatic idealism, informed naivete as sort of some of the chief, and they work really well. I mean, it's great. It's a very helpful rubric to look at things and be able to be like, oh yeah, like this is this metamodern sensibility that's very different from that older postmodern thing. So then it's just a question at that point of like, is that all this is? And mm-hmm. I'm inclined to say, well, maybe art's just the tip of the iceberg. Maybe this has much deeper cultural, structural roots. And then that's where you start getting into the theory about what we're really talking about and what is all this stuff. But maybe if we're going to stick on aesthetics for a second, I'll hold off on getting into some of that stuff.
Well, I think that's a nice setup, and the next chapter is on complexity. But let me I'll say, in terms of some of the parallel, in fact, I was just on, I'm in a number of different and although less involved, during my career, I've gotten involved in a number of different psychology domains. Okay, mm-hmm. So I enter into them. One of them is Division 24, and that's the theoretical and philosophical division, which originally was more connected to, I think, the modern view back then, but pretty quickly by the 80s into 90s had then basically been taken over by the postmodern critical view, so that its identity of theoretical philosophical psychology essentially was a post-structural, postmodern critique of the neoliberal empirical modernist view. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I was just on a conversation, and it still is that. And I then am able to recognize my own tension with that system, where I'm like, yes, there's issues of power. Yes, there's issues of context. Yes, this idea of some absolute liberal ideal of truth and power and what is empirical and all those require critique. And however, where does that ultimately get you? As it's a critical deconstructive view that is ultimately vulnerable to chaos, meaning it's sort of critiquing an undeserved hegemonic order and deconstructing it. But ultimately, when are you going to get reorganized to construct? And the reason I bring that up, and I then said that, in fact, I am in the midst still of an ongoing conversation, a revived conversation on the list that hadn't been there for a while. And several people sort of chimed in and said, yeah, I'm kind of tired. In other words, there's a fatigue in the theory, or at least potentially, we'll see. But a number of people are like, haven't we done this enough, right? And is there another dialectical side for us to be progressing, growing, And so I think it's an interesting point. The reason I'm bringing it up is that sort of in a theoretical philosophical structure, and we can go then, we'll be moving more into those, we see that a dynamic parallel between
Yeah.
sort of these opponent processes, and you can see it in the cultural sensibility, aesthetic sensibility.
Yep.
And I think it's fascinating to be able to see it in sort of these justificatory, propositional, analytic places as well. And I just share that nod to say, why do I see all this stuff connected? Well, that seems like a pretty obvious, interesting connection to me.
Yeah, no. And one thought that occurs to me that's kind of an interesting UTOK connection here is, right, that like, you've got justification systems, but in some ways they emerge out of and are built off of this sort of behavioral investment, system, right? And so our emotions are pegged, let's say, to the same sorts of phenomena that we are making sense of through our justification systems, and those are kind of in dialogue with each other. So like if I say something that attacks your justification system, you're going to feel that it's going to have an emotional register and all that, right? So there is this kind of feeling element to this as well. And so if we're talking about aesthetic sensibilities, I think there's a meaningful connection there where it's like whether or not people have all the propositional understanding of recursive reflection and all this stuff doesn't matter. It's like you just get tired eventually with seeing, for example, your superheroes deconstructed all the time, and you're like, okay, yep, seen this movie before. I'm, now what next, please, right? And so there's a kind of just aesthetic manifestation of something that can have some deep propositional roots, but it can also just be felt very viscerally. And I think that a lot of the art stuff is kind of that. And some people might experience it and not even make any of those connections, that just totally. It has a visceral connection to their lived experience.
Totally.
So,
and we can put that at the core of our cognition. If we take John Vervaeke really quickly and basically like, well, recursive relevance realization often can be framed as a dialectic between balancing order and chaos in the right criticality. Brett Anderson was on, and there's some series you were on, which right after you. His whole presentation basically is our core architecture of consciousness is about finding the criticality between order and chaos. You could certainly look at the postmodern critique as to deconstruct and chaotically reduce the order, the excessive order and the imbalanced power order of modernity. And then as that gains dominance, you're like, okay, there isn't enough structure, order, and so then the swing back even, and so yes, more than at just a justificatory level, although I think there's dynamics there. Just at the agent arena relation, you can argue this criticality, chaos, order, to find then the complex adaptive sweet spot, and that does set us up to move into complexity in the next chapter. Right?
Yeah. Well, just one thing I'll say really quickly about that is this interesting thing of like, like you have a conversation and it's dynamic and you hear an idea and you've never heard it before. And you're like, oh, wow, like this has a lot of repercussions. We have to really grapple with this, deal with it, et cetera. And like, that's great. Right. And it can be critical. It can be like an undermining of something. You're like, oh, wow, this changes everything. But then you have a number of those conversations and you have them in different places and across different domains. And the same basic point starts being made over and over and over again. And eventually it doesn't have the aha feeling anymore. It's like, yeah, we get that. And, and it's going on over here and it's going on over here. And what you do is you like see the structure of it. You're like, it's an object of thought now, instead of like a, whoa, interesting. It's like we have a term for that now. We know what that is. And that's, what everyone's talking about. And yes, so then you've moved from this moment of sort of reflection into like reification or making it something an object of thought. And so a lot of these postmodern critiques were coming in and they initially landed as like, wow, interesting. Ooh, this, but eventually it's sort of like, oh yeah, that's a postmodern critique and blah, blah, blah. And like, okay. And now what? You know what I mean? So there's this natural process that moves through that is kind of part of how we, reflect on new information and try to update our justification systems, et cetera. And yeah, as you say, like eventually then that's going to lead to a kind of recalibration or a kind of, an attempt to then fold that in a meaningful way that can then be adaptive and help you construct after that. So anyway,
no, I mean, there are lots of different kinds of, so there are two issues here, or at least, and one is sort of what are kind of opponent process, in this case, potentially between order and chaos, and what's recursive development, that as you learn what becomes essentially old news, and then what is the novel space that then needs to be incorporated. Now that I've included this, what becomes the edge of transcending it? because then it's essentially, once the pattern has been seen across a number of different elements, it gets locked into the operating system, and then it's essentially old news, and then you're set to look for other possible things. And on an opponent process thing, you generally want to then shift. If this has been emphasizing one side of that equation, usually the pull is then to emphasize the other side of the equation.
Yeah, well said.
So, and then so we move into complexity. And you want to share a little bit about that?
It's a very natural kind of segue, because I mean, all those dynamics we were just describing is like, you're talking about complex systems, and you're seeing, a lot of this stuff underway, this integration and differentiation leading, and the impetus for that chapter, how would I say? The reason, I guess, for calling it that, right, was that, so you get this aesthetic conversation that appears after 2010 and really starts growing, and, is really moving around in the academia and in the academy for some years, and people are doing that sort of stuff. And then in 2017, you get the publication of the Hansi Freinacht book, Leni Rachel Anderson, and Thomas Bjorkman. And so there's this sort of new stuff that is using this term metamodernism, but it's sort of framing the dynamics of cultural change in a different way, and it's doing different things with it. And so a lot of that is rooted in this sort of new framework paradigm of complexity. And so what is that? So for example, Hansi Freinacht's work is talking about the model of hierarchical complexity, and he's coming from a tradition that's sort of informed by integral theory and by Jürgen Habermas and other kinds of theorists who are looking at the way that the mind develops, which it does through a complexification process, in tandem with culture developing or complexifying. And so these things sort of dynamically feed back into each other. And that's a crucial aspect of thinking about the sorts of things we were just talking about. And so this is sort of a new thing on the table, let's say, that you don't find in the cultural studies side of the conversation. It's just not, so, and I'll say this too, and I think it's kind of important, which is that, like, when you dig deep into the structure, the structural theory of like the cultural studies folks, it is kind of taking their cue from Frederick Jameson, David Harvey, and like a kind of brand of Marxist theory that if we're going to drill down, we're going to look at economic structures, and you're going to get terms like Jameson had, that postmodernism was the cultural logic of late capitalism. And those that particular strand, that's kind of where they bottom out, as I understand it, in kind of their deep theorizing of this, that metamodernism is just the cultural logic of a slightly later stage of capitalism. But the psychomimetic complexification developmental thing is, I think, a deeper and more interesting kind of, it goes another level further, let's say. And so I mentioned Habermas, and he's kind of my connecting bridge between these, because he picks up on some of the dialectical materialism, which is what that Marxian stuff is, and adds that whole psychological layer. And so does Wilber, who picks it up from Habermas, and so on. And so you get this really interesting deepening of the theory, which is like, why do cultural logics shift? Why do they change? Well, because of complexification. And complexification is itself a form of, you could say, recursive kind of enfolding of older parts into new wholes that then are building off of each other. And so again, my attempt here was to kind of bridge these two, discourse, or these two strands of the discourse, by being like, oh, okay, so if we understand that this pattern that, the complexity people are kind of putting out there, as being related to a lot of the stuff we're seeing in the art stuff, what do we call this? And so I just tried to kind of fit those two things together, and I think hopefully in a compelling way. So the complexity stuff, it's just I think of it as a digging deeper into like the really, going to the core of some of the dynamics of psychocultural transformation, and focusing less on individual works of art or this or that, and really trying to analyze, the motor of this sort of a thing. And yeah, this will become important when we come back to the meta-narrative issue and your work and Bobby's work and whatnot. But at least that's the kind of through line and the leitmotif there that I see.
Right. And I think that's exactly right, in the sense that, I connect with both Lene and, Hansi, as in Daniel Gortz, and blog with them both, because I felt that and I know Lenne's very concerned about sort of the developmental argument in relation, and rightfully so at many levels. I think you can overshoot the concern, and so this is a dialectic here in relation.
Sure.
But if you want, from my vantage, especially this feels particularly true of sort of a modern Western vantage point. If you were to say to me, you want just a really quick gestalt of the evolution of cultural sensibility / justification types, to say that we start in the oral indigenous phase, and the task there is to get us in community, tribe, community level, engaged in interactions in nature, to manifest a collective in an animistic structure where we have felt relations across time and we create a shared relational world. That's the oral indigenous sensibilities and the belief value systems for that particular kind of world are there. And if you look at Tyson Yunkaporta and he asks, what are we trying to get back to? We can share this. There's a huge amount of wisdom there, but there's a particular type of sensibility for a particular type of organization that's afforded there. When we start building cities, right, that have, 1,000 and 5,000 and 10,000 and 50,000 and 500,000 people, and we have this massive industrial complex, there's a different kind of relationship that's necessary. There's a different kind of abstraction that's necessary for these traditional formal. And we see Bronze Age and Axial Age systems of justification that are emerging in those particular levels. And you have refined people that are then scholars, and we get writing, and we get all the capacity to be, your entire life can be spent as a priest learning this particular thing that then informs, anyway, all this. But the point of it is there's this evolution of complexification of both the technology, the justifications, and then the blending of the two with the industrial systems. And then, of course, that abstraction increases, the power of it increases in modernity. The critique of it, postmodern feels a little different in the sense, but nonetheless, it's definitely a sensibility in that regard. And then to step back and basically be like, okay, especially for where we are in the West, as a quick gestalt of the development of culture and society in a particular place through these phases, I think that's I found that to be a very, very powerful and reasonable view.
Yeah. And I mean, that was a very eloquent expression of it all. And I mean, on the one hand, it's also just like, sort of obvious when you read Yuval Harari's, Sapiens, for example. I mean, that's essentially it. I mean, Leni talks about it in her work in that way. And I think that's great. I think, then I think one of the challenges that's popped up in the metamodern conversation space is that once you start talking in terms of like these big stories of history and the directionality, let's say, of humanity, right? You're already in potentially dangerous ground, because people have been telling stories like that have tended to favor, our group or our race or our religion or whatever. And so those grand narratives were kind of, rightly critiqued by postmodernists for being like, whoa, these are, potentially dangerous and totalitarian, or they would say not even potentially, just they inherently are. And to be fair, like even in metamodern discourse, it's easy to oversimplify these things and wind up speaking in kind of easily reified terms, and then you kind of just reenact a lot of the old modernist, kind of imperialistic kind of presuppositions and this infantilization thing. And so it's difficult terrain to navigate, especially when we're particularly primed to be very sensitive to all the ways that it could go terribly wrong. And it does go wrong sometimes. And so sometimes, you'll see someone just referencing, oh, well, metamodernism says that, people are much smarter now than those, stupid people in the past or something, right? And then you could understand how like people doing cultural studies over here trying to analyze like Wes Anderson movies are like, look, we have nothing to do with that. So that's a lot of the dynamic that can show up when you're dealing with a discourse this broad. But I guess it's sort of like unfortunately, people will make those oversimplifications, and the fact that people will basically just have certain ham-handed approaches to some very nuanced and sophisticated and complex topics doesn't mean that we should just throw that stuff out, that it's not important for understanding the role of complexification in human history as an extension of cosmic complexification, et cetera. So I think that both explains, or at least, it'll explain some of the tensions that exist in some of the strands with each other. Particularly when, again, also one strand or let's say, if you're in academia, right, and you're triply sensitive, maybe sensitive beyond sensitive to any implication that there could be anything like that going on, then it just becomes two sides are just not going to speak to each other. But yeah, so I think that there is a very profound and interesting story to be told in thinking about these cultural shifts through a complexification lens. And I think maybe if there's a modest contribution to the conversation that this book can offer, it's that, okay, if a word like development is too it is too much, we can talk about recursive reflection. It's a fairly, neutral way of speaking about the way that cultural times are able to reflect on previous cultural times and kind of iteratively go in different directions based on what they've learned from the past. So yeah, it doesn't have to lead to, some kind of weird ideology or anything like that.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And we can, and in this, why am I blanking a little bit on the book? I read another book I read cover to cover is the Graeber book, like The Dawn of Humanity.
The Dawn of Everything.
The Dawn of Everything. Thank you. And you did an excellent series on that, by the way. And I think that's so to me, the issue is, let's enter that conversation, right? Of course. And there is, you can certainly take a multiplicity of different angles in the fine-grained element and see, wow, there's a lot of complexity in human development and a lot of variation, and there's nothing, of course, no simple linear line. So use the academic qualifications, engage the debate. For me, the gestalt, the grip of gestalt of utility is clear. Just don't simplify it and reify it in a particular kind of way.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, so I don't know, time-wise, just to make sure that we can get through the philosophy and the complexity, maybe I'll just jump into the philosophy part. So that chapter is, I think, pretty much entirely devoted to the work of Jason Ananda Josephson Storm,
which
who
is
published
new
the
to
book.
me. I need to get involved in this. This was an eye-opening, and I look forward to connecting with him. Sorry, I just
it's great. It's great, and I hope that the book has that effect of like, oh, I knew about this and this, but I'd never heard of this before. Storm's book is called Metamodernism, The Future of Theory. And what he's trying to do is very specifically work through a lot of the philosophical and theoretical sort of presuppositions of the postmodern paradigm and basically get to the other side of them by applying their own logic to themselves. And in kind of a classic Hegelian dialectical way, you find that by the time you've completed the move, you're dealing with something very different than what you'd had earlier on. So you actually negate this negation, right? If postmodernism in some ways reflects this negation of the modern, it's anti-modern, it's this negation of it. Well, if you apply that postmodern, negation to itself, so to speak, you wind up kind of spiraling back towards this affirmative, positive stance. And it becomes a lot clearer what's really going on there. And it's a more complete philosophical gesture. And so you're able to advance the conversation and get to a place that's sort of beyond the critique and beyond the cynicism and the sort of mode. And so he's a philosopher and he's an historian. And that book in particular is really just a kind of presentation of a potential new paradigm for approaching some really important issues that people face in doing scholarship in the humanities and the social sciences. So that right now it's still, albeit exhaustedly, in vogue to write another paper being like, oh, well, what is religion, or what is art, or what is anything? Because when you dig into it, everything falls apart, essentially. So what Storm does is take a lot of these critiques very seriously, but he goes the next step, and it's like, okay, so if we see that these things all fall apart in the same way, then that will tell us how we could rebuild them in a way that we've sort of integrated the insight of the weakness of this approach, right? So Storm's book is deep, and there's a lot there, and it's very rich. So it's hard to summarize, and even in my book, I attempt to, but people should go check it out and read the book for themselves, because especially if you are theoretically inclined, philosophically inclined. This is, I would say, the kind of propositional content that's sort of implicit in that sensibility, aesthetic, visceral aspect. And so that's why, again, and to the degree that there's a through line here, again, Storm is very explicit that he's inspired by this Hegelian dialectic of that you advance thought, you self-apply the thing from the past onto itself, and that'll get you a new thing, which is a kind of iterative, recursive move that generates this new transcendent leap. So, just again, in sum, is like my whole attempt with the book is just, what's the through line?
Totally. I mean, and that's like symbolism of the aqua coin again, with the I is basically, hey, as you multiply it to, ultimately it recursively adds a dimension, but recursively returns also. So it's I and -1 and negative I and back to 1 in a particular way. So there's a symbolism there. And I don't know, that was my first real introduction. I haven't gone out and gotten the book, but it's on my to-read list. And I really look forward to diving into that perspective because it looked like a lot of similar but also novel angles on this approach. So that was an area that totally opened up a window to me that I look forward to filling in, and I like what I saw in that regard. And I maybe even reach out to him and learn more about what he's doing. Yeah.
And I mean, so and as that's actually a good segue then to get into the meta narrative part, because I'll say for the Consilience Conference, my paper, The Reality of Meaning, was included an explicit synthesis of your work with Storm's work. Specifically, it related to this semiotics aspect. Because, one of the aspects of postmodern semiotics is that, language doesn't really mean anything. It just kind of never really relates to anything because it all gets deferred into different words. And Storm is trying to make the argument that, no, communication is animals communicate. Animals are part of the world, and they are meaning making entities, and basically totally coming from an independent direction, drawing on ecological affordances and the kind of extended cognition theory of Fourier cogsi, developmental theory a bit, and just gesturing towards a lot of the recursive relevance realization, and a lot of the stuff that you talk about in your book in terms of language coming along and adding this tagging feature that tracks changes over time and sort of maps onto other forms of kind of sense making and meaning making that exists further down the stack, so that you don't get just language deferring and infinitely meaningless. You get language that relates back to the world. So hylo means world or matter, right? So it's it's a language, it's a way of talking that is actually meaningful, and it's a reclamation, I think, of in an important way of language and meaning. But anyway, so that was part of my Consilience paper, and I see deep overlaps between your UTOK framework, being in dialogue with Storm's philosophy. There's a lot of rich connections there. But in the meta narrative chapter, which is where your work features very prominently, along with Bobby Azarian's,
love the pairing.
It's then, because you explicitly deal with the metamodern framework, so does Bobby, and you both kind of situate yourselves in that. And again, it's this interesting thing where you're in it, but you're also about it in some kind of interesting way, right? Recursively. So I just basically look at how this recursive iterative process this is a kind of meta theoretical process that unfolds in culture, and that the whole complexification thing that you describe is part of this sort of things building on themselves and leading to to higher order hierarchical structures that are able to then recursively reflect on themselves, and that's where you get things like agency and whatnot. So so just in brief, your work and Bobby's work, which in other books I've written, I've synthesized as well, just seemed like it's no accident that these folks are having these theories and relating them to a metamodern paradigm and seeing how this plays out at that level. Bobby talks about cultural worldviews as being sort of a, like a superorganism Markov blanket for what you would call like a justification system for the social organism. So yeah, anyway, so just to kind of wrap it all up, the book does kind of proceed from sort of the particular to the grand.
Before we get to the final, because then this is a bridge. So let me make a couple of comments. So Bobby and I did our thing completely independently. I read his book. He happened to know about, he's a cognitive neuroscientist. I don't think it's accidental, psychologist. And we did put John in that category as well. And you see the mind science people, bridging between down into biology and physics and then up and then finding and from a UTOK perspective, this enlightenment gap, this inability to see mindedness in the world relative to other, forms of, in the world. So anyway, Bobby's, we have slightly different metaphysics. That's very seldom, but Bobby tracking the evolution of complexification in a very, very similar way. So, and then revitalizing romance of reality. So I both of us, I think, are giving very similar thematic meta narratives, and I throw John in that also to give this sort of like new mind science frame for the whole big picture that also then is going to speak to issues like meaning crisis, mental health crisis, and provide a new kind of gripping function for our place in relationship to nature, place of mind in relationship to matter, things along those lines. So I appreciate that.
And the fact that, again, it's not an accident that this issue of meaning is just ubiquitous in all of these frameworks, whether that's a semiotic meaning returning, whether that's the kind of, wisdom, the meaning you're talking about, where you go back to the art and you see people, grappling with meaning and existential, significance and purpose and all these things. The fact that the 2022 blockbuster was Everything Everywhere All at Once. It's this profound grappling with nihilism and meaning. It's just meaning is pervasive in the whole conversation. I didn't even mention Alexander Dumitrescu's work, but also similar. So they're just, again, it makes sense. After postmodern deconstruction of meaning, you're going to get a reconstructive project that's sort of integrating its insights, but moving the next step. And I also just want to note, too, that I do mention as well John's work in that meta-narrative chapter, talk about meta-religion and religion beyond religion, and gesture to some of his work and my work and Layman Pascal's work and sort of the stuff we're doing in this domain. So, so trying to move just like, across these different levels and tracking the different characteristics of this exciting new, cultural paradigm. I guess that sort of brings then into the last quick chapter, which is like, what is
before we go into the worldview, I wanted to make this point because this is when I caught the going meta and the recursion. So in the development of UTOK, there have really been four major points. There was the 1996 point of justification. So that's like getting outside. And the 1997, the whole map of the tree of knowledge. So now I place myself in this recursive map. Then there's the emergence of the garden, which the epicenter is this small me, big me, metaphysical, empirical, scientific, humanistic gestalt, which then places you in relationship to that, and then ultimately places the unique subject in relationship to that with the I-quad coin. So those are the four, and each one of those is an angle on self-recursive awareness. They all have this part of both the knowledge and the knowledge of the knowledge and the place of the knower in relationship to the knowledge. And that's why I'm very drawn. I can critique, well, should we use meta? Meta's overused, blah, blah, blah. Like, this fucking thing just aligns with my experience and the trajectory of this theory I went through in a very, very profound way over and over again. So I just wanted to say that, hey, when I look back at an honest articulation of what it is that has been transformative, it's putting each one of those can very clearly be defined as placing the knower in relationship to the known in a very self-conscious way, in a novel way, in a layered way, in a progressive, include, and transcend sort of way. And then that's
and to echo that, I mean, the whole grand gestalt of the UTOK thing is this, we are epistemic knowers, agents aware of the ontic world that we are a part of, and that we are an instantiation of. So we are necessarily having to reflect on ourselves in order to understand the world, and we have to understand the world to understand ourselves. So there, it is just it's
That's basically how we frame John and I together frame transcendent naturalism. I mean, that's how we framed it, right?
Yeah,
so, yeah, and totally.
Yeah, and I'll throw out too, especially because we're talking about meaning and all this recursion stuff. I find it interesting that, right, there's a version of this recursive move, and probably maybe even one people experience as an early form of this, that is the Hall of Mirrors. It is the infinite regression. It's the void. It's the abyss. It's sort of, it's the vertigo of things falling out under your feet. And because there's just this exhaustive multiplicity, right? And there's this exhaustive sort of layering and confusion of, well, I'm in the world, but I am the world, and I'm experiencing the world. Right? And so that can be very disorienting and kind of have a very negative valence to it, that it might be experienced as a form of nihilism. And so I find it fascinating that metamodernism, big picture, is sort of like taking that idea, but extending it further so that it folds again one more time in a way that Hall of Mirrors becomes this sort of empyrean. It becomes this sort of like, wow, it's the portal into a transcendence that is actually the source of meaning and the source of insight and the source of wisdom and knowledge. And so that's just a fascinating metaphysical move there.
And totally non-consciously, but I basically play that out in both episodes, only in going from one direction to the other in the other direction. I'll explain. So when I stumble into justification, okay, I become self-conscious of that, but it begins to dissipate into, oh God, we're all just essentially the postmodern problem. Although I have a new problem, I still have this issue. We're all a bunch of fucking justifiers. And what are we actually going to ground ourselves in? But ultimately, it catches with the tree of knowledge that actually says, well, there's a transcendent line into science that then bounces back and situates this. So then the tree of knowledge provides a particular holding environment dialectically with the deconstructed justificatory narrative. Then I build the garden, which is this whole kind of structure. And then it's like, well, what about the unique individual in relationship to this? Where does that fit in? Where's the individual looking at the mirror now that I have the sort of the Hall of Mirror architecture? And then the coin pops out of that to hold that time. So in both cases, you have this sort of emerging dimension that really actually where the just then counterbalanced by the tree of knowledge, then ultimately the garden counterbalanced by the coin. Both of them have this element that starts and then finds the recursive looping hole. And so that's, again, where I saw what you were doing with the way you framed the opening chapter is like, hey, this thing zooms, gives you a potential mirror, but you follow it in the right way. And all of a sudden you're going to get a picture, a dialectical picture of a whole.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't mean to preempt the jump into the last chapter worldview bit, but I think we're there, because it everything we've just been saying, it should be obvious how this is such a transformation of the way of looking at the world compared to if you're still in this sort of postmodern deconstructive mode. A film like Everything Everywhere All at Once gestures towards this direction. I don't think it fully completes the move, but it does gesture towards the metamodern movement out of the postmodern nihilism and that kind of Hall of Mirrors and everything. Totally. And just everything that we're talking about does reposition the agent in relation to the cosmos in a way that is provides new affordances, that's reciprocal opening, that is meaningful, et cetera, et cetera. So that, my contention or the argument at the end of the book is that, what is this thing? What is metamodernism? Well, I call it a worldview because I think it is a very comprehensive, way of orienting your thought. And I use that word more or less interchangeably with a phrase like justification system, because I think that works very well. Which is to say, how do we justify ourselves and our actions in the world, and how do we make meaning and find things relevant and try to explain ourselves and the world to us and ourselves to other people, et cetera. That when you're operating with this kind of framework, a lot of clarifications and new ways of seeing things kind of fall into place that have that are the product of a certain kind of working through some ideas, and those things have a visceral, embodied kind of aesthetic aspect to them, but they have propositional content, and they have a deep structure to them and how they work. That is also the structure of how much of, if not all of, the cosmos itself is sort of unfolding. So it's for me, it's a way of kind of framing big picture wise the whole metamodern discourse in a way that that isn't just a paradigm. It's not just a way of analyzing art. It's not just this or that. It is a gestalt, I guess you could say. So that's what the last chapter tries to do.
Right, and I thought that was and it is more, to me, certainly, indeed, what I'm trying to do indeed with the coin is actually it's more than a justification system. We're actually transcended into a transcendent gestalt that certainly has propositional networks, but it is to use a Wilberian term, we're really looking at a vision logic here.
Well, it's a justification system of justification systems, right? I mean, that's right. So it's a cultural logic of cultural logic.
Right, exactly. And then for me, then certainly from a UTOK vantage point, we can actually get quite specific about these sort of complexified coordinates with this whole idea of the fifth joint point, whereby we basically are like, okay, we are waking up to a particular level of consciousness in between, to use Zach Steiner, but time between worlds in relationship to the digital globalization or whatever meta crisis problems that we face, whereby the old modern to postmodern structural system is not up to the task of a digital globalization world that puts that kind of tax on Mother Nature in a particular type of way with a game A type of, engine underneath it that then is like, oh no. Right. And if we don't wake up, and we need some sort of psychedelic altered joint point consciousness that enables us to kind of reframe in a kind of fun, ironic, oh God, complex, sincere way, our way of being in the world and start to rewrite a narrative on top of the narratives that have come before. And so to me, that kind of, the worldview characterization is exactly right. And it add a vision logic gestalt way that is trans-justificatory potentially. That's a kind of sensibility I think we need to arise in the wisdom stack and to afford, what kind of organization is going to unfold in a potentially sustainable, healthy way as we move towards, the 21st century and all that it poses for us.
Yeah. And also, I mean, one thing I guess I would just say is that, talking in terms of worldview is not ideology. That's not it's nothing specific. There's a structure to this way of thinking that, you can be other things and you might not use the word metamodernism at all. It's not, there's no attempt here to try to, make converts to this sort of a thing or to try to subsume any and all things into this thing. It's just purely like, this makes a lot of sense. And when you orient from this way, you're seeing the world differently and you're probably behaving differently as a result, and you're interacting differently and you're justifying differently. And so it's a way of being that I think doesn't need to be exclusionary in all the other things that it can also encompass as well. So just wanted to throw that out.
That's the sensibility that I get off the term. It affords a calling, but it's not totalitarian. It labels, but doesn't dictate. It enables, and it enables the kind of coherent integrated consciousness that I think this time requires. If only somebody could have laid it out for us. Oh, wait, somebody did. And I hope that it's appreciated. I love the cultural logic of cultural logic. And I hope we wake up to the appropriate cultural logic that this time requires. But you've certainly given us a hell of a map to think about and told, I thought, a very sort of a surprise, and I mean this with all due respect, but as I said, I sort of came into this thing sort of lightly thinking about a summary, and and I've been, hanging with Metamodern, you and Layman and Lene and Daniel, but this took it to another level, Brendan. It really did. In my
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And people are starting to read it, and I'm looking forward to people's feedback and critique. And so I hope that, at the very least, it can provide a helpful summary of, some of these ideas, because maybe people have never heard of some of these thinkers. So at least I hope it can be a kind of primer for people. And at most, I hope it can help convincingly make some connections between all this big picture. I would love it if, given that all these strands of the conversation, they might tend to be siloed. I'd love it for there to be more cross pollination and that sort of a thing. So I've been working in various ways to try to bring things together. I'm actually, Jason and Nada Josephson Storm and I just started this journal, or co-editors of this journal now.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I want to make sure we touched on that. Yeah,
it's called Metamodern Theory and Praxis. And so, that one is kind of like, it's open to, again, kind of cross pollinations for these different metamodernisms. It's kind of emphasis, or kind of orienting guiding star or something, is people who want to make use of some of the interesting paradigmatic contributions that Jason's put out there in hylosemiotics and other things. But it's not restricted to that. I mean, people who want to do different things under this umbrella, we invite those sorts of engagements. And again, what I'd love to see more and more of is putting conversation, more metamodern thinkers together into dialogue. My
intent is to read that and maybe even submit a paper looking at his work and my work together.
Yeah, I'd love that. I think that'd be brilliant. And so that's one attempt. And another thing is Sky Meadow Institute, which is kind of, I think, probably more reaching out to a lot of the integral metamodern community connections and stuff. Otherwise, trying to have conversations across the different strands. And I hope this book works to bring some of these things together. And if it doesn't, for some people, that's fine too. But
well, all we can do is deserve it. We can't command it. And I think you've deserved it here.
Thanks,
and I hope it's been clear what I feel about it. And I've deeply appreciated the position of UTOK in relationship to it. And may it bloom and grow. I think it's the kind of cultural sensibility, worldview, consciousness, etc. that we need.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all that. And thanks very much for having this conversation. This is great. And I feel like we were able to very impressively get through a lot of this content in a relatively short period of time. So hopefully people were able to track with that and check out the book and give it a review, and I'd be greatly appreciated. But thank you, Greg. Much appreciated.
Absolutely. Thank you. Deeply appreciate it. And I look forward to sharing this with everyone. Thanks so much.